Okay, so I wanted to make a little video showing like how you can tell between the different types of inheritance, whether it be autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, or X-linked recessive. So in this thing, I have a little summary that does it, pretty much can tell you all you need to know, is with these 4 boxes, right? With these 4 boxes, you can see autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive. So we'll start with autosomal dominant. The way you tell with this one is you have 2 affected parents, right? And they actually produce an unaffected child. Well, why does that tell us it's dominant? The reason why is because if they were recessive, it would be impossible to have an unaffected child. The reason being is because if you do a Punnett square, right? R, this would be little r, this would be little r, this would be little r, this would be r, giving you 100% chance to have a little r. So there's no way to have like a little r, or big R, big R, if this was recessive. That's why we know this one is dominant, because it actually has an unaffected child with 2 affected parents. Okay? And you can read down here to pretty much say what I just said. Okay. For autosomal recessive, it's kind of like the opposite. When you have 2 unaffected parents, they produce a affected child, right? That tells you this is a recessive inheritance, right? The reason being, again, if you do that Punnett square, and these are little r, right? And they're unaffected, it'd come out to 100% chance being little r. Therefore, these would have to be the same. Okay? But this also shows, essentially, that this is a skipped generation. That is key to recessive, is if there's a skip in generation. What that means is, I'll scroll down a little bit just so we can show an example. For recessive, right, if you have unaffected parents and they produce an affected child, that's a skip generation. So any generation where you have unshaded and then all of a sudden a shaded comes out of nowhere. Okay. Now, when it comes to stuff like this, just this generation here, ignoring the bottom generation, this doesn't mean skip, right? A skip has to have a affected child in the next generation with 2 unaffected parents. That's key sign that that is recessive. If you see 2 unaffected parents and an affected child, that is recessive. Now you just have to figure out recessive dominant, recessive autosomal or recessive X-linked. Okay, so that's what I want you to figure out. As soon as you see 2 unaffected parents, 2 unshaded, and an affected child, you instantly cross out anything that has dominant in them. You just pick the recessive answers. Okay? Okay, moving on. We have X-linked dominant. Now, X-linked dominant has a 100% incidence of affected daughters from an affected father. That is key. Now, this suggests X-linked, meaning it could be autosomal dominant, but it's suggestive of being, X-linked due to the pedigree of X-linked, which I'll show a little bit down here. Okay, and then X-linked recessive, this one, again, cannot be confirmed, but 100% incidence of affected sons from an affected mother. Okay, so you see how the affected mother's here for recessive? She has to be double X, little r. Okay, so if you have that, she has to pass down that trait. And the reason why is because the son only gets 1X, and that 1X only comes from the mother. So it doesn't matter if the father's dominant, because he'll have this, right? Little big R, Y. That big R will never go to the son. The son always gets the Y. So if the mother has two of the same allele, which is the little one on top, the son will always get that. So in X-linked recessive, that'll show in all the sons from an affected mother. If there's an affected mother and all the sons are affected, that is almost always going to be X-linked recessive. The reason why it's not always is because technically autosomal has a chance for that to happen. But then you look at the other generations and the other relatives within the family, and then you see that it changes. But for the test, if you see affected mother and all affected sons, X-linked recessive. I don't think he's going to trick us on those. Okay, and then we can see here with the pedigrees, right? With X-linked dominant, like we said, 100% incidence of affected daughter from an affected father. You see how the father's affected here, and all of his daughters are affected? Right? But none of the sons. The reason being is because when you do the pedigree, the father always goes on the left and the mother always goes on top. And the top row will always be daughters and the bottom row will always be sons. You don't have to memorize that. But as soon as you see a Y in one of them, that's obviously the sons, right? Because X, Y. When we do the pedigree, we see that the X from the father always passes on to the daughters and not the sons. Always passes on. So whatever the father has, that's going to pass on. If it was recessive, not a big deal. The mother's alleles could make up for it. But when the father is dominant with a big capital R, that means that trait will always be expressed. Always be expressed. Okay? If it's an X-linked dominant trait. Right? 100% chance of girls receiving the trait. Right? They're heterozygous, but as we know for dominant, as long as they have one big R, it'll express. Okay, so moving on to X-linked recessive. This one is, again, going to have the thing where the sons coming from an affected mother. Or unaffected mother, sorry. There'll be a skip in generation. Or can. What can happen is either this pedigree, which shows like, okay, yeah, well, they're both unaffected. Yeah, they're both unaffected. But all of a sudden, wait, all of a sudden we have, affected children. That tells us it's recessive, okay? But now how do we know if it's X-linked recessive? Well, the way we know X-linked recessive, again, the father can't really pass on the trait. So if we look at the mother, if the mother's affected, right, in this case she's not, but if she was affected, it would have a 100% chance to pass on to the sons. And that would be, I didn't write it down here, but we can, I have one later, we'll explain it. Right? But even in this situation, this is the skip that I wanted to show, right? The mother has a big R and a little r. She's heterozygous. And when it comes to recessives, that means she's a carrier. Okay, this is a carrier. The father can't be carriers for X-linked because they only have one R. And that one R is going to be whatever the trait is. That one R express whatever it wants to. Because it doesn't have another one to override it, like for the daughters. Right? So even though the mom passed on a recessive gene to the daughter, her father's X had a big R to counteract it. So she's going to show a heterozygous dominant presentation. Okay, moving on. And this is 50%, but if the mom is little r, it'll be 100%. 2 sons. And that's what's showing here. I'll show that a little bit later. Okay, so this is a dominant autosomal inheritance or autosomal dominant. I just wrote it just so that we're going to figure out dominance first, then we'll figure out whether it's autosomal or not. Okay, so the reason why we know this is dominant is it's kind of hard to tangle out with dominant, right? Because technically it could be recessive, but the key thing is that you don't see a skip in generation. If you don't see a skip in generation, then it's not, just go with dominant, because he's going to be very specific with recessive, showing skips, because he was emphasizing that. Okay, now is this a skip? Well, no, it's not, because there's no affected child. If this child right here was affected and colored in, then that would be a skip. But since there's 2 unaffected parents, right, which in dominant, 2 unaffected parents are little r, they'll always produce, right, unaffected children. That's like a key thing. They might not have that, but again, if they don't have a skip, it's autosomal dominant. Okay, so we're going to look here, right? We have a affected parent, and since we know it's dominant, you're going to put R question mark. And the question mark is only a placeholder until we figure out if it's heterozygous or homozygous dominant. And again, for every single one, if you know what's dominant, all the shaded are going to be little r always. Just write those all in. Okay. Well, if we look at this, these pairs actually produced a little r. Okay. And I'll show here that let's say if the mother was big R, right, and the father was little r, we know that if I fill in this chart, this is not what the mother should be. The mother can't be this. Because look, there's a 0% chance of the mother producing a little r. So this is not a possibility in this pedigree for this person here, right? So automatically we can change this to heterozygous big R, little r. Okay. Actually, I'll just leave that in there. I'll just make another one. Oh, sorry. That one. So I'm going to write the other pedigree. Father goes on. It's actually, I did this wrong. The father's supposed to go on top. No, I did that right. Father's supposed to go on the side. Sorry, I'm still trying to get this stuff straight in my head. So we'll do this, right? I'm just going to fill it in like we're supposed to. And look at that, 50% chance of having little r. That doesn't mean that the pedigree necessarily needs to have two people affected, two siblings affected and two siblings unaffected, but that's just the probability. Each child has a 50% chance of being heterozygous dominant or homozygous recessive, so affected or unaffected. Okay. So what was the key to knowing it's dominant? There's no skip in generation. Okay, and then how you know it's autosomal dominant, if we look up here, right? Well, X-linked dominant will show a father passing it on to all of his daughters. Okay, now this one, it's kind of hard to tell, but the fact that we have affected sons, it probably is not going to be a dominant X-linked. It can, but we can't definitively say it's X-linked, so we're just going to stick with autosomal. If you cannot definitively say it, we say it's autosomal for now. Okay, that's how you know it's autosomal dominant. Okay, moving on to autosomal recessive. This one, we can actually look, right? So let's go down the generation. So generation 1, right? We have an affected and an unaffected. Okay, can't really see too much from there. Okay, moving on. We're going to go down, and then we see this totally unaffected generation. Well, that's interesting, because if we assume this person is dominant, right, then there's no way to have a totally unaffected next generation. Reason being, I'll just write it in real quick. Let's say the father is, we're going to assume this is a dominant one, okay? So if a dominant one, that means it's shaded, are going to have big R question mark. In this case, we'll just do big R, little r, as an example. So we'll do big R, little r, and then we know that all the unshaded would be little r, little r. This is an example of dominant. I'm not saying this is how recessive looks, right? We'll do this, this. So there's a 50% chance per child is unaffected, but kind of weird, right? Not super there, but that doesn't tell you anything. Realistically, that won't tell you the difference between recessive and dominant definitively. Okay? So we know this is autosomal recessive, but how do we know? The way we know is this little group down here. This one right here tells us. This is the key to knowing this is recessive. Look at this, right? 2 unaffected parents. All of a sudden, 2 unaffected parents produce an affected child. Is that possible? If the unaffected are recessive. So I'll write it in here, right? This is the recessive one. So if we were assuming these were recessive, because we're like, oh, this might be dominant, right? Oh my gosh. Okay, that means the unaffected are recessive. Well, if we write that in, right, like this, well, let's do the pedigree for it. Dang, 0% chance to be dominant. And with our assumption earlier is if we were thinking this was dominant, that means this isn't possible. There was a 0 chance of this being possible. So that's how we know this is not dominant. Actually, I'll just do this. It's easier. That's how we know this is not dominant. That's how you really hone in on why this is recessive. Okay? So what this is these are unaffected, and since we know it's recessive, unaffected means dominant, meaning R question mark, right? R question mark. But what we can discern out is they're probably both heterozygous, because the only way to get a recessive child from 2 dominant parents is if they're both recessive. 25% chance. Little r. Okay. The reason why is because if we do the other ones, right, big R, it's like we know that one, no way, right? There's no little r's to be had. And then if we do big R, little r, big R, well, there's no way for that one either, right? Because they'll all be dominant, and you'll have 2 homozygous dominant and 2 heterozygous dominant. Either way, no chance of having little r. So, that's not possible. So that's we know those 2 parents. We know those 2 parents have to be heterozygous. Okay? So what's the key to recessive? Skip generation. 2 unaffected parents producing an affected child. That's key to knowing it's recessive. Now, how do we know it's not X-linked? The reason why we know it's not X-linked is because if we go up again, X-linked recessive shows 2 unaffected parents and then all affected sons. When we go down here, we have 2 unaffected parents. Oh, wait, a daughter. Right, that's weird. That doesn't usually happen. If there's no, definitive, all the boys are affected, right? See how these boys are unaffected? It probably is not going to be X-linked. For X-linked recessive, look for all males being affected in the latter generations. Okay? If there's some males that aren't affected, like this one and this one, probably not X-linked. Okay? And we'll show that down here. So, X-linked recessive, right? Well, how do we know this is recessive? How do we know? Well, we see these 2 groups, right? We see a group here. We see a group here that are called skip, right? We talked about this. We have unaffected producing an affected, right? Now, this is technically not a skip, but from here to here is, because it's these ones produce an unaffected. Okay, that could happen. But these ones produced an affected. That's how we know it's recessive. That's the key to knowing it's recessive, is that skip. And there's actually another one here. Now, how do we know it's X-linked? Well, let's look at, with X-linked, always look at if it's, if there's any sex-linked inheritance. Yeah, duh. But look if there's a predisposition, I think the word is, to it being male or female, right? Well, we look at this, oh gosh, they're all males. The only affected are males. Now, it could still be autosomal, but testing-wise, if you see all males, it's going to be X-linked recessive, right? And this point, we saw that it was already recessive. So if we see that it's, it has a leaning towards one sex, so males, it's probably going to be X-linked. Okay. The way we know that is because if the mother, right? The mother, let's stick with this group down here. We're going to use this group as an example. Well, the mother's unaffected. The father's unaffected. Well, we know the only way for 2 unaffected to produce an affected is if it was recessive and if both parents, or in X-linked, it's just the mother, if both parents have heterozygous or heterozygosity. Okay, so the mother will be big R, X little r. Father, it doesn't have heterozygous and X-linked. He is unaffected, and we know this is recessive, so he's going to have a big R, and then he'll have his Y, right? Well, let's check it, okay? We're going to fill this out. Okay, so daughter 1, right? Big R, big R. Daughter 2, big R, little r. Okay, son 1, big R, Y. Son 2, big R, little r, Y. Okay, well, this one states that if they have recessive, if they only have a recessive allele, they're gonna express the trait. Well, guess what? There's one that has that. Right? This one doesn't have it because the dominant allele is covering the recessive. This one has 2 dominant alleles, so it's gonna be dominant. This one only has 1 dominant allele, no other alleles to be had, so it's only going to express that dominance. So 25% chance of any child having the gene. But in X-linked, we usually just associate that with like, oh, but we only can talk about boys. The boys have a 50% chance. Okay. And if the mother, for instance, was affected, so let's do one where mother's affected, father's unaffected, we pass down, and all of a sudden we have a girl, we have a boy, he's affected, we have another boy, well, he's affected, another boy, he's affected. When the mother is affected in an X-linked recessive, so it will be big X, little r, and the father's not affected, so he's going to be dominant, right? When we write it out, what does the boy or any of the boys have a chance of being recessive, therefore affected? Well, it looks like they all do. 100%, right? That's a situation where you have 100% of the boys being affected. If both parents are unaffected, the boys have a 50% chance, but the girls have a 0% chance. That's the key, right? If you're only having boys affected, X-linked recessive. And you can double check that with seeing if there's a skip generation to show that it's recessive. Okay, moving down to X-linked dominant. Okay, X-linked dominant. This one, the key is that, gosh, I have to remember. Let me see, hang on. Let's go back up the top. You see, I'm still forgetting this stuff. X-linked dominant. It's going to show where 100% of incidences of affected daughters from an affected father. Sorry, see, I'm still trying to figure these out, right? And this one's a little confusing because we don't have an affected father initially. It's only affected mother, okay? That's not going to help us. Okay, they have some people offspring, okay? We don't know. It could be, we don't know yet. There's no skip in generation, so we're leaning towards dominant. But autosomal versus X-linked, we don't know yet. And then we look down here. Oh, we have affected. Always look for, once you figure out it's dominant, look for a father who's affected, and then look at his offspring. Wow, 100% chance of daughters having it, right? Now again, doesn't technically mean it's X-linked, but testing wise, probably if they're showing this to us, where like the father's affected, and then none of the sons are, but the daughters are. We should be leaning towards X-linked dominant, okay? And we're going to show that here. We're going to focus on this group here, okay? So if we know it's dominant, we know it's X-linked dominant, the father has to have big R and Y, right? And then the mother, if she's unaffected, and we know this is a dominant tree, the only thing she can be is little r. Because even if she had one big R, she would instantly be shaded in, instantly be affected. Okay, so now we're going to write this in. Again, mother goes on top. Father goes on the side. We're going to fill this in. Okay. Then we're going to go down to the sons. Oh, look at that. We're going to focus on the daughters this time, right? We see the daughters have 100% chance of being heterozygous, which means they're dominant, right? Sons have a 0% chance if the mother is unaffected, right? It's key. If the mother's unaffected, 0% chance of being dominant. That's our key on the test, is if you see an affected father with an unaffected mother, and then you see only girls affected in the next generation from him, it's probably going to be X-linked dominant. You know, maybe not 100%, but probably. And the only one I didn't put in here was that mitochondrial one, which I thought it was, once you get the rhythm of it, it's pretty easy, right? If you have an affected mother, I know I'm moving on from those pretty fast, but I just want to throw this in there real quick. Okay, we have an affected mother. Wow, that's a bad diamond. Right? All of her offspring are affected. Let's say all of her offspring are affected. Well, what's that probably a sign of? That's probably a sign that this is mitochondrial, because the only mitochondrial DNA comes from the mother. So and that's in her egg, right, in the ovum, she passes on all of her mitochondria. The sperm doesn't donate any mitochondria. So the reason why it's 100% is because you're always going to have 100% of the egg, right? It's not like some of her eggs have it, some of her eggs don't. All of her eggs have the same mitochondrial DNA. So she'll always pass it down. Now, you may see, like, you know, the affected boys from the mother. Oh, well, they had a daughter and she's unaffected, right? Oh, that makes sense, right? And then, but when you go to the daughters of the mother, they will too have affected children. Right? But then again, all the boys may not. The girls will. So when you see that, like that pattern of mother passing down a gene to all of her offspring, and you see that kind of same pattern start happening in other generations, it's going to be mitochondrial. Inheritance. I probably misspelled that, but it's okay. Okay. So these are a couple examples with Punnett squares. I just wanted to clarify some things I didn't make super apparent in my portion of the lecture. You can read over the lecture again if it didn't make sense, or rewatch this video, or watch the video I posted at the bottom of the lecture. I just wanted to give one more resource possibly to help understand this. If you need any help, message me. I'll try to go over it and explain it better, and answer any questions there are. Okay, thank you.